My name's Melissa Dreyfus. I work at EPA headquarters in the Water Quality Standards program. I have been at EPA for a little over 10 years. Most of that time has been in the Superfund program, and then the last couple of years or so have been in the Water Quality Standards program in the Office of Water. I am the staff lead for the Academy, so I facilitate the Academy when we have it in DC. And then I'm also the staff lead for Water Quality Standards Variances, which I'll be speaking to you about today. And you will be seeing a lot more of me today and tomorrow for our various lectures and group activities, but I brought candy, so don't worry, it'll be fun. Okay, this is very loud. Okay, so this is just our standard disclaimer slide. In case of any dispute of accuracy, the written word takes precedence over what I might say today. So I think we've gone over this in the other presentations. Okay, so today you're going to learn some of the basics about water quality standards variances, understand how a variance can help get real improvements in water quality, and then we'll talk a little bit about how to decide if a variance is the right tool for your situation, how to adopt a variance and submit it to EPA for approval or disapproval, and understand how variances relate to some of the other Clean Water Act programs. All right, so what is a water quality standards variance? So you have heard throughout the week about Section 101A2 of the Clean Water Act. So the objective of the act is to restore and maintain the physical, chemical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters, with the national goal that wherever attainable, an interim goal for water quality that provides for the protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, and recreation in and on the water. So part of that, an interpretation of that wherever attainable goal is that the goal is to make water quality better, but that goal may not always be attainable, readily attainable. So in August of 2015, EPA published a final rule in the Federal Register updating the federal water quality standards regulations to improve implementation of the Clean Water Act in 6 key areas, which are listed here. Important for the conversation today is there's a new section on water quality standards variances at 131.14. And these variance requirements really strike a balance between providing states and authorized tribes and dischargers the time and flexibility to make incremental water quality improvements that reflect the best that can be achieved in a given period, with accountability measures to assure the public that progress will actually occur. So what is a water quality standards variance? It is a time-limited designated use and criterion for a specific pollutant from a specific source or for a specific water body that reflects the highest attainable condition for a specific period of time. So it's a regulatory mechanism that ensures water quality progress when the designated use and criterion are not currently attainable. So we like to say it could be called a transparent path for accountable progress in water quality. So I'm sure you've probably seen the schematic throughout the week, but you'll recall the core components of water quality standards are the designated use, so the desired function of the water body, the criterion or the water quality levels that protect the designated use, and then anti-degradation. You'll notice anti-degradation is not shown on the diagram today because variances don't apply to anti-degradation. And then one way to implement water quality standards is through NPDES permits, where the permit must derive from and comply with the applicable water quality standards. So to really understand how variances can lead to water quality, we need to understand the link between variances and NPDES permits. You see here this transparent box here. Water quality standards, again, are these time-limited designated uses and criterion. Variances specify the pollutant or pollutants and reflect the highest attainable condition during the term of the variance, so during the length of the variance. And the highest attainable condition, and I'll talk more about what that means a little bit later, that's inherently less stringent than the unattainable underlying designated use and criterion, right? And so then once EPA approves the variance, that becomes the applicable water quality standard for the purposes of the Clean Water Act, for the purposes of NPDES permitting, and can also be used for 401 certification. I will note that for example, 303D listing and TMDLs must continue to be based on the underlying water quality standards, which must be retained. Our rules specify also that all other water quality standards not specifically addressed by the variance, including technology-based limits, remain applicable. And that's because the purpose of a variance is to make water quality improvements. So you want to ensure all the protection provided by the other water quality standards still apply. Okay. And so the regulations really provide certainty that variances are recognized as a legitimate tool available to states and tribes for managing complex attainment issues, and may be applied to a single discharger, multiple dischargers, or to a water body. And we'll get into that a little bit later as well. But to really understand how these water quality improvements can be made, we need to understand the link, again, between variances and NPDES permit limits. So I mentioned a variance is a water quality standard itself that requires submittal to EPA for review and approval, just like any other water quality standard. And once the water quality standard variance is approved by EPA, it becomes the basis for the permit writer to establish a less stringent WQBL for that specific pollutant based on the HAC and the HEC for that discharger. So basically, the water quality standard variance has to be a standard because otherwise there would not be that legal way for the permit writer to write a less stringent permit limit than what is needed to reach the applicable water quality standard.
Sorry, I think this goes back to the previous slide, but so you can't have a variance if there's a TMDL in place? Or you could, but you would still have to comply with the TMDL?
So I'm going to get into that. That's a very
Okay.
good question. So the question had to do with sort of the relationship between variances and TMDLs. You can have a variance when there's also a TMDL in place, but if you don't mind saving that, and we'll get to it a little bit later. Okay, great. Good question, though. Okay. So for your first pop quiz question, true or false, a variance replaces the underlying designated use and criteria? Oh, good. Great. We're all learning. Okay, that's correct. So variances, again, establish the temporary alternative requirements for NPDES permits for 401 certification for that particular permittee or water body segment for that particular pollutant during the term of the variance. Okay, so how can variances lead to real improvements in water quality? So you may be asking, when could variances be useful? So they could be useful when attaining the designated use is not feasible under the current circumstances, but could become feasible should circumstances change. So, if a less expensive pollutant control technology sometimes could become affordable, or local economic conditions change such that what is now not affordable could become affordable. That could be one case where a variance could be useful, or if a state doesn't know if the designated use can be attained, but progress can be made in improving water quality in the interim by implementing known controls and tracking those environmental improvements. So, question.
You use a variance for a narrative objective, and you come up with a way to translate the narrative objective into a numeric objective.
Right, so the question was, could you have a variance to a narrative criterion? So you could, but so the variance, you'd have to define the highest attainable condition, and then the permit writer would need to find some way to translate that narrative into a numeric.
That would be the purpose of the variance. Like, we don't have that translator, so we need a variance so we have enough time to develop that translator.
The variance.
Yeah, maybe Gary.
The variance requires that the highest attainable condition be articulated as a numeric, some numeric objective.
It needs to be quantifiable. Yeah.
The other component of it is that the utility of a variance is where the discharger is not able to satisfy the effluent limits that are captured in their permit. And so in your situation, if the narrative hasn't yet been translated, functionally there wouldn't be a need for a variance because they're not out of compliance with their effluent limits.
They're out of compliance with these standards.
Receiving water limits.
Potentially, and that's a larger question that I'm interested in as well, but I don't know if it's within the scope of this topic.
Okay, maybe we can.
Or this presentation.
I just had a hypothetical question. Could you use a variance for a biological objective if you had a numeric receiving water limit?
So the highest attainable condition just needs to be quantifiable, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So if you could find a way to make that quantifiable, then possibly.
Okay. Hypothetically.
Hypothetically. Okay, so these are all great questions, thank you. So a couple of questions that we get often happen to be about what's the difference between a compliance schedule and a variance, or between site-specific criteria and a variance, so I'll go over that briefly. So the difference between compliance schedules and variances, both of these tools have very different purposes with distinct regulatory regulations behind them, but they can be used together. But for right now, I'll talk about a compliance schedule is appropriate when the time and actions needed to comply with the WQBL are known. So the discharger, time might be needed for a discharger to modify or upgrade their treatment facilities to comply with the WQBL and a permit. The compliance schedule provides an enforceable series of actions to reach that WQBL as soon as possible. A compliance schedule is granted by the permitting authority. It's usually within the special conditions of the permit. And compliance schedules have their own set of statutory and regulatory requirements, one of which is those enforceable series of actions that I just mentioned. So on the other hand, a variance would be used when the actions and time needed to comply with the WQBL based on the underlying designated use and criterion are uncertain. But again, remember, there could be progress being made to improve water quality. Variances are a temporary designated use and criterion. So a variance is a water quality standard itself, unlike a compliance schedule. And they're the basis for a less stringent WQBL in the permit. And one other note is that since a compliance schedule is a condition of the permit, it can't be extended except in rare circumstances. A variance, on the other hand, we call it, they're not renewals, but a permittee or another variance, subsequent variance, could be approved as long as it meets the requirements of 131.14. So the difference between a variance and site-specific criteria, you learned earlier this week, site-specific criteria are used where the same designated use will be protected, but with a different, so more or less stringent water quality criteria. So you might have had site-specific scientific information that would lead you to know that, I guess, it could be a more or less stringent criteria and could still support that same designated use. A variance would be used where the designated use cannot be achieved for a period of time, and so the state would adopt a less stringent designated use and criterion to be put in place for a specific period of time. Okay, so I mentioned before that EPA promulgated 131.14, specifically authorizing the use of variances and the requirements to obtain EPA approval. States and authorized tribes, therefore, are not required to adopt their own authorizing provisions or procedures to be able to utilize variances as a tool. We have seen several states that have chosen to do so. So those authorizing provisions or procedures would be considered standards that would need to be submitted to EPA for review. The regulations also reduce uncertainty and facilitate effective implementation over a defined period of time. And we'll go through some of the specifics of 131.14 right now so you can see what some of those requirements are. So this is a basic structure of 131.14. You'll see it's broken into 3 sections. The first section's applicability. So this talks about where, when, and how the variance will occur. Part B is the requirements for submission to EPA. So this is divided into 2 sections. B1 has to do with what a variance must include, so the requirements such as the permittee, the pollutant, the applicable water body, the term of the variance, the highest attainable condition. And then B2 is the supporting documentation, so what's required for the state to submit to EPA to support the different components of the variance and justify the need for the variance. That's really what EPA uses during our review to ensure that for approval that the variance complies with the Clean Water Act in 131.14. And then Section C of the regulations talks about how to implement variances into NPDES permits. All right, so I'll just briefly go through what a variance must include. So some of the requirements for a variance as laid out in our regulations. So a state or tribe can choose the scope of the variance as long as it's justified. The variance must say what pollutant the variance is for, and then different types of variances may be appropriate to deal with different types of situations. So it could be a discharger-specific variance, so this could be for an individual discharger, multiple dischargers, or for a water body or water body segment. And just a note about multiple discharger variances, rather than thinking about an MDV as sort of a special type of variance, it might be more helpful to think of it more as a administrative process that allows for adoption of many discharger-specific variances at once. So the purpose of a multiple discharger variance is to reduce the administrative burden associated with adopting many similarly justifiable single discharger variances. So there's no requirement to group dischargers together. You really only want to do that if it makes logical sense. So if there's some commonality, they're all the same type of facility or they all function in the same type of way, would you group them together? There's no requirement to do so. And just like any other variance, a multiple discharger variance still has to fulfill all the requirements of 131.14, and all of the dischargers must still qualify for that variance. So you just want to make sure, none of those dischargers within your multiple discharger variance wouldn't similarly qualify for a single discharger variance.
Melissa, for the multi-discharger variance, would we have to make a demonstration, or would the facilities have to individually make a demonstration that they qualify individually for variance, or can they be grouped in the analysis?
So I think there's a couple ways to think about this, and Gary can also add to this as well. So they all need to qualify for the variance. So they would need to have some sort of, Gary will go into the different factors you can use, but basically to say they'd all need to qualify for the variance individually. So you could also, there's some language in the regulations about having some eligibility criteria, and maybe Gary, you want to elaborate further on that?
I think what you're getting at is do you have to actually analyze the data from each individual discharger or multiple discharger variance? The requirement is that every discharger would, in the multiple discharger variance, would be eligible for a single discharger variance. How you demonstrate that doesn't necessarily require you to look at each individual discharger, but whatever demonstration you provide has to, provide some evidence that all of the dischargers in this multiple discharger variance would be eligible. So, there have been some states that have used a representative sample of dischargers to, show that the entire group qualifies. So you don't have to necessarily look at the data for each individual facility, but whatever you do, it has to somehow demonstrate that every individual facility would qualify.
So on this one, so you have to specify each, so you have to do the pollutant, the dischargers, and the water body, or is it or? Okay.
It's all of them. So each
Okay.
variance must say to what pollutant the variance is for. So it's a variance for mercury, and
yeah,
then it would
that
need to
makes
say
sense.
for which discharger or for which water body or for which series of dischargers. And then you would need to say which water body they're discharging to.
Okay, so you can just do a general variance for a water body and pollutant.
You could do a water body variance, and then it would apply to all the dischargers on that water body.
Okay, so you don't necessarily have to name dischargers.
Correct. Well, it would be a water body variance, but then in the permitting authority would need to look
implement.
at the variance in order to make the permits for all of, when considering the permit limits for the dischargers on that water body.
Oh,
When we say each multiple discharges, you mean that it's a cumulative impact, all of them, or we will select just most stringent from these multiple discharges, and based on that we create variance. Do you see what I mean? Sometimes some dischargers influence and enforce the other one, and then together they provided more impact rather than separately.
So you would need to determine, well, there would be two different situations. So if it's a single discharger variance or a multiple discharger variance, each discharger conceivably would have their own highest attainable condition. So that would be dependent on the conditions specific to that discharger, what's the best that they can achieve over the time frame of the variance. That would be their highest attainable condition, and I'll go into what that means on the next slide. And then the permit writer would use that HAC to determine their effluent limit based on that highest attainable condition. If it's a water body variance, and I have actually a point on that now, so let me get to that. So non-point sources can have a significant bearing on whether designated use and criteria can be attained. So it's really essential to consider non-point sources and potential controls when adopting a water body variance and identifying the highest attainable condition. So we have two additional requirements for water body variances. For the initial variance, the state must identify and document cost-effective and reasonable best management practices for the non-point sources and provide public notice and comment on that documentation. And then for any subsequent variances for that water body, the state must document whether and to what extent those BMPs are implemented and the water quality progress that's been made during the previous variance term. So we do have those two additional requirements in the regulations for water body variances. Okay, so yeah.
Just to clarify, when you were saying you have to identify the BMPs, you mean for non-point sources or for both? Okay.
For non-point,
thanks.
yeah. For a water body variance, yeah. Okay, so this is a slide talking about the HAC that I've been referring to. So for a variance, states must provide an alternative set of requirements that apply during the variance. This is what the new NPDES permit limits would be based on. These requirements must reflect the highest attainable condition during the variance. So the HAC, or highest attainable condition, is a quantifiable, which is important, expression of the best condition that can be achieved during the term of the variance. It's important to note that a variance cannot lower currently attained water quality. So remember, going back, the purpose of a variance is to lock in water quality achievements that have been made so far and make further progress, not to make water quality worse. So the state must specify the HAC for the water body or water body segment as a quantifiable expression that's one of the following. And this is in our regulations. So the first option is a highest attainable interim criterion, which likely would only be for a water body variance. Then the second choice is an interim effluent condition reflecting the greatest pollutant reduction achievable, or if there's no feasible pollutant controls, an interim criterion or interim effluent condition reflecting the greatest pollutant reduction with optimization of installed treatment and adoption and implementation of a pollutant minimization program. And our definition of a PMP is at the bottom of the slide. So the HAC3, that third choice, that's really when you have a facility that has done all that they can do. There's no other feasible pollutant controls that can be installed. And so your HAC, the quantifiable portion, is where they're currently at. So the interim effluent condition likely reflecting the greatest pollutant reduction with the optimization of installed treatment. So basically the best that they can do with what's already been installed, what's installed currently at the time the state adopts the variance. And then they also have this adoption and implementation of the pollutant minimization program. So that's where you're getting your water quality progress, your water quality improvements is from those PMPs. Okay, so one common area of confusion regarding variances is the difference between an HAU, the highest attainable use, and the HAC of a variance. So there's some similarities, but then I'll talk about the differences as well. So you'll recall from earlier in the week, the HAU is the modified use that's both closest to the 101A2 use and attainable based on the evaluation of one of those 6 factors at 131.10G that precludes the attainment of the use. And so HAC is a similar requirement. It's a quantifiable expression of the best condition that can be achieved during the term of the variance, remember, not lowering currently attained water quality. Some of the differences, so the HAU, remember, can only be expressed as a use. It applies only to Clean Water Act 101A2 uses and subcategories of such uses. The HAC, on the other hand, does not have to be expressed as a use. You saw that we just had 3 options to define the HAC. And it applies to a variance for either a 101A2 or non-101A2 use. One other thing I guess I'll note, just the word condition. So we were purposeful about saying highest attainable condition because it encompasses something beyond describing the use in the ambient water body. So remember, one of those choices was the interim effluent concentration. Yeah.
The way that this is being described almost sounds like an end run around redoing your beneficial uses. What exactly is the difference? Is it that other people can meet this particular effluent limitation, but your particular discharger can't?
Right, so you would use a variance when, so certain dischargers, for example, can't meet the QBELs that are based on the underlying designated use and criterion, but they can still make progress. So this is really a way to continue making progress in water quality improvements, whether it's at the water body level or the specific discharger level. If the state's really in a place where they don't think that any more progress can be made, that's when you might consider a use change. But a variance is really a way to make some water quality improvements.
It may also add an advantage of a variance would be that it usually only is applicable to a single parameter. So if you're changing your use, then you're basically changing all of the parameters for that use, and you're lowering the protection for all those different parameters. Where your problem may just be a single parameter. With the variance, you're keeping the high protection levels for all those other parameters, and you're just affecting the single parameter that the variance is applicable to.
Right, yeah. Okay. All right, so some of the other requirements, the variance is required to have a specific term. So that can either be a specified time after EPA approval of the variance or a date. So it could be, 10 years after EPA approval, or it could be, July 3rd, 2025. The time frame must be justified by describing the pollutant control activities that need to occur during that term. The variance also must be established after a public hearing consistent with all the public hearing requirements, including 13120. Remember, a variance is a water quality standard, so it's subject to all the public participation requirements as for any other standard. There is one other requirement for reevaluations for a variance of a term of longer than 5 years. There must be reevaluations that occur to reevaluate the highest attainable condition. Just a little bit of backstory on this. So back when EPA was proposing the variance regulations, we had proposed a 10-year maximum on variances. And some of the comments we received pros and cons. So some folks had said that 10 years is not long enough due to the administrative process needed. And we had also received comments from, the public or environmental groups saying 10 years is too long. How can you just have, a variance for 10 years and no real way to check up that progress is being made? So the compromise is this reevaluation requirements. There's no federal maximum term on variances. There is, you'll see the little asterisk there. The Great Lakes waters that are subject to Part 132 have a federal maximum term of 5 years. But instead of a federal maximum term, we have these reevaluation requirements. This is to provide that transparency and that opportunity for the public to know that the variance is being reevaluated at predictable intervals, and that there's a time limit on the variance. So the requirement is that the variance must specify a frequency to be reevaluated that has to be at least every 5 years, and the reevaluations must be submitted to EPA within 30 days of completion. There also must be language in the variance that says that if those reevaluations are not conducted and the results aren't submitted to EPA within 30 days, then the variance is no longer the applicable water quality standard until which time those reevaluations are conducted and the results are submitted to EPA.
How many times that variance, that it can be reevaluated?
So it has to be at least once every 5 years. The state can specify when they want that to be. And I have an example actually in here that I'll get to, but so some states could choose to have it align with triennial reviews. You could have it align with permit reissuances. So it can be whenever they want, as long as it's at least once every 5 years.
It looks like that it's if we have possibility to evaluate a few times, for example, 10 times or 20 times, it means that it's smoothly moved to site-specific standards, like.
Well, I mean, so one thing that kind of goes along with the reevaluation that I actually didn't mention, but if there is a more stringent highest attainable condition identified at the reevaluation, that then becomes the applicable highest attainable condition. So I don't know that a state would necessarily choose to reevaluate more than once every 5 years, but I suppose if you wanted to, you could.
Every 3 years at a triennial review is a
Right. Yeah.
Triennial review each 3 years. It will be. Looks like.
Okay, so this is just a summary of the requirements. Remember, we talked about the scope. The variance must identify the pollutant or water quality parameter and the water body or water body segment to which it applies. The state must identify the interim requirement, which is the highest attainable condition that must be quantifiable, but can be expressed as an interim ambient criterion or as an effluent condition. The variance must identify the variance term. That can only be as long as necessary to achieve the HAC. And then there's that reevaluation component I just spoke about that's required for variances with a term of longer than 5 years. And then remember I showed you section B2 of the regulations talk about the need for supporting documentation. So remember, a variance is a standard, so it goes to EPA for review and approval or disapproval. And so we use the information that the state submits as supporting documentation to help us decide whether the variance is consistent with the Act and the regulations. So the regulations define 3 key areas where supporting documentation must be submitted. The first is to show the need for the variance. This need is based on one of 7 factors, so it's the 6 factors under 131.10G, and then also one additional factor that's described in 131.14, which is basically has to do with restoration due to dam removal and a few other restoration activities. And then the state also needs to send supporting documentation showing that HAC really is the highest attainable condition. How is that the best that can be done over the term of the variance? And then showing why the term of the variance is justified. Why do they need that much time to achieve that highest attainable condition? Yeah.
Sorry. What are you looking for in terms of the time to achieve the condition? Because I thought the difference between this and the compliance schedule was that you didn't know how that was going to happen.
So, so in determining the HAC, this is what you're saying is the best that let's just say it's a discharger variance. This is the best that discharger can achieve in my 10-year variance. So you now know what you're trying to achieve, right? You've come up with that highest attainable condition. So that means you can lay out how much time you think it would take to get there. So let's say, it looks like it's clicking for you now, but I'll just expand my example and say, so let's say it's an HAC2 variance where your HAC is an interim effluent condition, and the facility needs to install some sort of technology. So you then lay out as your term, well, we need, this amount of time to get our funding together, this amount of time for installation, this amount of time for monitoring and evaluation, and that's how you come up with your term. And all of your supporting documentation would lay out, how you came to that term and how you would justify that time frame. So, right, the difference is that a compliance schedule, they know the time needed to meet the underlying water quality standards. In this case, you're coming up with a term to meet the highest attainable condition, but you can also get a compliance schedule in combination with your variance. And I'll show that to you in a second. So typically I would give a demonstration of our variance building tool here, which is our online implementation support tool, but I'm going to finish going through the slides because I want to make sure we have enough time to do that. And then I'll go back and show you a demonstration of the tool if we have time. It would actually be great on your evaluation forms if you're feeling so inclined to fill those out. So we now have a variance exercise later in the afternoon, which is going to run you through a couple of different scenarios where you can work through some of these variance requirements and the sort of information you might need in a very hypothetical, basic exercise type of way. So it would be great if you could let me know if you think the variance tool demonstration is still a helpful component of the lecture portion, given that you have an exercise. So if you think of that at the end of the day, any feedback on that would be appreciated. We didn't have a variance exercise, a couple years ago, so it's a new component. So anyway, we will continue on. So this is just a schematic about the basic variance process to sort of lay it all out there in one diagram. So basically the state or authorized tribe and the dischargers would determine the key elements of the variance. So those are kind of the key requirements that I just talked about. The state or tribe would then seek public input on the variance as part of their public participation process, which would include a public hearing. The state would revise and adopt the variance based on those public comments and then submit the variance to EPA for review. EPA reviews the variance as a water quality standard. Once approved, the variance is then in effect for Clean Water Act purposes, and the variance of longer than 5 years is reevaluated at those defined time periods. And then you'll see that yellow area on the left, just encouraging the state or authorized tribe to work with EPA early and often, to talk through the variance, and that helps to expedite some of the administrative process.
If you have a TMDL for a particular water body, can you do a variance?
You can do a variance. And I think someone else had that question earlier, and I'm getting to that, I promise. I'm sorry, I know the suspense is killing you, but I'm getting to it. It's in there, I swear. Okay, so one other thing on subsequent variances, I mentioned this earlier. There's no prohibition on adoption of a subsequent variance. You can get another variance once the initial variance expires, as long as the requirements of 131.14 are fully met again. So essentially you're submitting a new variance to EPA. It's not a renewal or anything like that. And then we have those additional 2 requirements for water body variances that I mentioned earlier. Okay, yes.
I'm sorry, I had a couple slides behind you. I got a little confused when you were talking about the supporting documentation for the variance.
Okay.
And the third point was to demonstrate that it's only as long as necessary to achieve the highest attainable condition.
Yep.
But then I got confused because that sounds like a compliance schedule, which we said that was different in that the time to comply versus variance, it's uncertain or unknown.
Right, so you're determining the term of your variance after you know what the highest attainable condition is. So remember the HAC are the interim requirements during the term of the variance. So this is what's going to become the basis for your permit limits, essentially, right? So these are your interim water quality standards. So you're then in a place where you're, I'm trying to explain this well. So you know what your limits are going to be, so then you're trying to determine what the amount of time it's going to take you to get to those limits. So you're going to say, well, I'm requesting a 10-year variance, and as I was describing before, these are the reasons why I need 10 years. Like, these are the steps I'm going to take to get these 10 years. You can also have a compliance schedule in combination with your variance. So your HAC is your applicable water quality standards from the time of adoption of the variance, just like any other water quality standards applicable from the time EPA approves it, right? But if the discharger can't meet the effluent limits based on that variance from day one, then they can get a compliance schedule to meet the HAC by the end of the term. And I have a nice little graphic to show that in a couple of slides. Go ahead.
In practice, oftentimes the highest attainable condition and the term of the variance are determined together.
Right.
Because there are some situations where, given more time, you can do better. But, the uncertainty increases the more, the further out you go in time. And so, it's a matter of, coming to some point where you are, you have enough certainty about how far you can get in this amount of time, and then you decide on what is the appropriate highest attainable condition and term that together, support each other.
And there's a nifty diagram coming up that will help understand. Okay.
Our variance is, we keep talking about discharges. Our variance is limited to point source use.
So you could have a single or multiple discharger variance, which would be applicable to point sources. And then if you have a water body variance, you would want to consider your non-point sources as well.
And if we just have non-point sources, but we have, folks that we can put our state permits on for that.
Well, the
A
variance would
variance
only be
only
applicable.
applies to a permit
Right.
or 401 certifications. That's the only thing that a variance can apply to.
Right.
So there are some requirements about considering non-point sources when, adopting a water body variance, but it has no legal, there's no legal implementation affecting non-point sources.
Okay, so our first quiz question. True or false? State or authorized tribes must conduct a public hearing when adopting a variance. Great, yes, because a variance is a water quality standard. It's subject to the same public participation requirements as any other new or revised water quality standard. Okay, true or false? There's no limit on how long a variance can last. I heard a smattering of both. So, so this is true with a giant asterisk next to it. So remember, there's no federal limit on the term of a variance other than for the Great Lakes waters under Part 132. Going along with that, though, the term can only be as long as necessary to achieve the HAC. So, the state needs to send in that supporting documentation showing why the term is, what's justifying the need for that length of time. So there's no federal maximum term limit, but you do still need to justify why that amount of time is needed. And then again, there's those reevaluation requirements for a variance longer than 5 years. It must be reevaluated at least once every 5 years. Okay, true or false? States or authorized tribes must reevaluate all variances at the time of permit reissuance. Good, okay. That's indeed false. They just need to choose a period that's at least once every 5 years. And so this is really hard to read on the slide, I know, but it's also in your materials. This is a schematic just showing an example of a state choosing reevaluations at permit reissuance. And I'll just go through it briefly, but if anyone has questions, maybe we can talk about this after when it's a little bit easier to see the example. But you'll see here on the top in purple is the variance. So variance 1 starts here at year 0, and it looks like it's a 20-year variance there. This middle section, the numbers are number of years. And then this gray box below is permit reissuance. So the permit you'll see are every 5 years. And then the WQ bell, so the smaller the box, the more stringent the WQ bell. So you'll see here, year 0, the state adopts the variance and EPA approves it. Year 3, there's a triennial review, and then the state chose to align the reevaluation with permit reissuance. So they did the reevaluation at year 5, and there's no, they didn't find any data to say that there should be a more stringent HAC, so there's no change in the WQ bell. So then you have your triennial review at year 6 and year 9, and then you have your reevaluation at year 10. They have some information based on public input or maybe from the triennial reviews saying that there could be a more stringent HAC. And so remember, if there's a more stringent HAC identified, that then becomes the applicable HAC for the variance. And so then you're going to have a modified WQBO, which in this case is more stringent and is the smaller permit, smaller gray box there. So this is just kind of laying out an example of how it could work, aligning a reevaluation with permit reissuance. Yeah.
So if you do the reevaluation and you find there should be a more stringent HAC, do you have to go through the rulemaking process to, okay.
No, that's why the language should be in the variance itself.
Okay,
So you've
just-
already adopted that into rule.
Okay.
And so then it says that, you know, the more stringent HAC shall become
apply.
the
Okay.
applicable HAC. So that's how that
Okay,
works, yeah.
thanks.
I also
That's
wanna-
actually a question coming up.
I also want to add that, you know, before, to the left of this diagram, that permit box was larger. That when they adopted the water quality standard, the water quality-based effluent limit got more stringent, but just wasn't stringent enough to meet the underlying standard. So there's progress being made. It's not just a status quo.
Right. Okay, our next question, true or false? If a state or authorized tribe does not submit the results of a reevaluation according to the frequency specified in their variance schedule, the variance expires and they must readopt the variance through another rulemaking process if they want the variance back. There's some very hesitant trues and falses. So this is false. So the requirement, or the regulations require that the state submit the reevaluation within 30 days, the results of the reevaluation to EPA within 30 days, and if they don't do that, the variance is no longer the applicable water quality standard, and if and until the state conducts the reevaluation and submits the results to EPA. So once you do that, then the water quality standard variance is back in effect for Clean Water Act purposes. It's just sort of, I guess you could call it suspended during that time that the reevaluation requirement wasn't fulfilled.
How does that affect the effluent limitation?
Well,
What it means is that you've got a
it's technically
permit.
a permit as a shield, right?
What it means is that what you have is a permit that doesn't derive from and comply with water quality standards. That's
Right.
what it means.
So you don't want to be in that situation.
Also, a comment on the previous slide regarding the rulemaking component of the variance. The manner in which California adopts permits, the way in which we construe the federal participation in the hearing requirement under the federal rule, we view it as being satisfied via the due process and hearing provided for the single permit action. And so in order for California to comply with the federal variance rule, if it's just a single discharger or a single permit, our view is that we don't have to undergo a rulemaking separate or in addition to the actual permit action, but the permit itself would contain the variance component, and the permit, though established by the board, would also have to say that the underlying conditions for the variance are not valid until approved by EPA. So that's how we both satisfy the the permit requirement, but also are not required to undergo an additional rulemaking for that single discharger variance.
I'm not sure if this is more of a comment than a question, or maybe people have some idea, but I know in California with NPDES permits, often we'll adopt a separate time schedule order or cease and desist order that has a time schedule that says, okay, you have your NPDES permit with the limits, but we know you can't meet those because you need to install some technology. And so we have, the way I've seen it most often is we have a separate order, and so it's not in the permit itself that we're giving the variance, it's the separate outside order. And so I don't even know of a circumstance when we usually, I'm saying we, the regional boards, do this on an individual basis.
You're
I
talking
don't know
about
if-
an enforcement order or something like that?
Well, usually, because in California, right, there's mandatory minimum penalties for violations of NPDES effluent limitations, right? So to get, you can get MMP, a shield from MMP enforcement if you have a time schedule order or a cease and desist order that has like interim limits and a schedule.
That sounds sort of similar to a compliance schedule. So you know the discharger can still meet their WQ ballot derived from the underlying standards?
Right, but it lives outside of the NPDES permit, so we don't get EPA approval for that.
So the variance is actually a standard establishing interim designated use and criterion, so it's a little bit different because this,
Okay.
I don't know all the details of this, but it just sounds like you're still coming up with some sort of schedule or interim points but you're still meeting the underlying designated use and criterion in
Right.
the end. So that would be the difference. So the variance
Okay.
is actually establishing interim designated use and criterion, so a different water quality standard. So you're no longer trying to meet the underlying. I mean, ultimately, you're trying to work toward meeting the underlying. But during the term of the variance, you're trying to meet the highest attainable condition, which are interim designated use and criterion.
Okay, so it'd be a situation where it's the water's more far gone and you can't.
Well, it's a situation where the discharger shows that they can't achieve the underlying designated use and criterion for a specific reason. So one of those 7 factors. And so you are adopting a time-limited, less stringent designated use and criterion. Versus in your situation, it sounds like you are still
yes.
trying to work toward achieving, their underlying is still what's applicable, right?
Right. Right. So
That's
it seems like the same way of getting at a similar way of getting at the same endpoint, and so I was just curious if anyone knows when the regional boards actually.
I think they're different endpoints though, because you're working towards the underlying designated use and criterion, and the variance itself is working towards this interim designated use and criterion. But Gary, did you have something
I just
to
want
add?
to make a comment about the adoption process. In order for EPA to act on a variance that's submitted, we need a certification by the Attorney General that it was duly adopted, or is into regulation
Legally
in
binding.
the state in some way. And so I'm not sure exactly the process that you have in California for permits, but it's because it's a variance is very permit centric, but there has to be some formal indication that it was adopted as a standard into, not necessarily through some formal rulemaking, but that there has to be some certification by the Attorney General that it is a duly adopted water quality standard that EPA is acting on. Otherwise, we can't act on it. We can only act on new or revised water quality standards.
So I do know that that's the rule in the Clean Water Act, or the regulation regarding standards generally. But I will note that when we submit a standards action, we don't submit Attorney General certification along with it. So I don't know if anyone here knows what we submit, but I know we submit an OCC certification that we've complied with Port of Cologne and the federal participation regulations. Perhaps the Attorney General has delegated us as a lawful entity to provide the certification, but we would similarly do that along with the water quality standards variance, even if it was a single permit action. And the reason why we wouldn't do a rulemaking is because, as a matter of California law, we only are obligated to do a rulemaking if we establish a rule, and a rule is something that generally affects the public. Just like we can do a single permit TMDL or a TMDL by single permit, when there's one person at issue and that one person is the subject of the due process and the hearing, and others are invited to participate, we don't need to undergo rulemaking for that one person. So we construe it similarly as a TMDL. Whether it need to be a rulemaking or not depends upon the folks to whom it is subject. But it sounds like there's some tension between EPA's view and California's view on whether rulemaking is required as a matter of law.
I mean, I don't know, Terry, if you have anything to to add to that.
Yeah, so the Attorney General's certification for California, and I don't know what the history is, but that's what we call OAL. We assume that OAL is equivalent to the Attorney General certification.
Which is the Office of Administrative Law.
Yeah, Office of Administrative Law, OAL, yeah. What was the second question? All right, yeah.
Okay. Yes.
I think it's more a question for the state board. So I understand variances are really focused on permits, but it's still a standards action. So I'm wondering, are we supposed to include those in the basin plans, especially if it's a water body variance?
Where does Stacy, I don't know if you heard the question or not.
I think the answer is no, but I'm going to still defer to Stacy on this one. Would you mind just asking again?
Yes, I was wondering if we're supposed to include the variances in the basin plan, since those are still standards actions.
I would say.
It's something that makes sense during triennial review. You might want to incorporate them by reference or identify them. When the variance is ultimately satisfied or extinguished, then it kind of sort of clouds up needlessly your basin plan. But I know that what EPA wants is certainly, what does EPA want in terms of how what does EPA want in terms of how we chronicle it and keep it? Because I know it's an adjacent process to our basin planning. It can go in there, but it needn't. But EPA and the public needs to be aware of those variances that we establish and that EPA approves.
I'm taking the mic to say I have no comment.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just say, what Gary had said and we've said before. I mean, EPA needs to be able to act on variances as water quality standards. So I would guess, however, the public has access to other water quality standards, if it's in your regulations, if there's some sort of list that you could list the dischargers and then incorporate that list by reference. I think there's probably various options that we could talk about. Okay, so just in the interest of time, I'm going to move on because this is the question everyone's been waiting for. So true or false, a variance acts as a replacement for a TMDL when a water body is listed as impaired? Okay, that's false. Okay, so remember I said before, a variance only applies to NPDES permits and 401 certification and does not replace or change a TMDL. So they do actually complement each other. Because a TMDL specifies what's necessary to attain the designated use, and then the variance allows a discharger that cannot meet the permit limits derived from the TMDL to at least be making incremental progress. And then remember that all other dischargers on the water body still have their permit limits based on the waste load allocation of the TMDL. So just to kind of back up a little bit, the permit regulations say that permits need to be, and I'm paraphrasing obviously, consistent with the assumptions of the available waste load allocation of an EPA-approved TMDL. So because the waste load allocation is based on the underlying water quality standards and not the highest attainable condition, the waste load allocation is quote-unquote unavailable for that specific discharger subject to the variance for the term of the variance. So for that specific permittee, let's pretend it's a single discharger variance, that permittee for that particular pollutant during the term of the variance, their waste load allocation is unavailable, and so then their permit would derive from and comply with the variance. And then once the variance term ends, then they would be subject to the waste load allocation again. Does that make sense? So then there's also, in that section of the regulations talking about permits and variances, if a permit writer knows that the variance is going to expire during the term of a permit, then they need to have two permit limits, one based on the variance and one based on the underlying water quality standards. Or if there's a TMDL in effect, then it would be based on the waste load allocation of the TMDL. Okay, you seem like there's a question back there.
So the variance doesn't apply to the TMDL, but the construction you're doing it's not available. So it's a way to construe it so it does apply to the TMDL?
So we're saying that the TMDL doesn't change because there's a variance in place. That's what we're saying. So why the variance doesn't apply to a TMDL, it means like the TMDL is not changing because there's a variance in place. For that particular permittee that the variance applies to, their permit limits for that particular pollutant subject to the variance, they're based on the variance, not on their particular waste load allocation.
Okay.
But for everyone else, subject to that TMDL, they're still subject to the waste load allocation and load allocations of the TMDL.
So what if you had a water body specific variance? So it would apply to all.
Yeah, that's a good question.
So-
Well, so, the state could also consider, if you need to do a TMDL, you could prioritize which water bodies you're doing TMDLs on also. If you know that there's going to be dischargers with variances, you could prioritize doing a TMDL on a different water body, perhaps if you know you're going to be making water quality progress using variances on that water body. Looking at my TMDL to make sure I'm not misstating anything. I don't know, Gary, if you have a water body variance, well, it would only be for that particular pollutant, right? So your TMDL would still apply for everything else. It would just be the variance applies for that particular pollutant for that particular period of time.
But so if we had the TMDL for that specific pollutant, though, in that water body specific variance.
Right, so I believe that in that case, the variance would apply for that particular pollutant, but the TMDL, I guess, would apply. The TMDLs for other pollutants would still be applicable.
If for a water body variance that has a TMDL at the same time, I mean, obviously, there's a lot of overlapping, work being done, in that situation. And so, there certainly, you'd want to have some coordination between the TMDL and, and if you were adopting a water body variance to that water body with a TMDL.
And certainly
For that TMDL.
Yeah, and of course, the water body variance is a rulemaking. It would be a basin plan amendment, and necessarily you wouldn't create a conflict with an existing TMDL for the same pollutant. You might, revise and do away with that TMDL if the variance is for that whole water body for that specific pollutant, right?
But I think we normally aren't allowed to withdraw the TMDLs, right? EPA. This is an EPA question, I guess.
Well, you still
Well,
want your
this
TMDL to be effective because the variance is term limited. So the variance would be in effect for a certain amount of time, and then you still want your TMDL to be in effect because the water body is impaired, right? So you still need to have your TMDL there. Your variance is only for a specified period of time, like 10 years, say. So, you still want your TMDL to be in place. It still will be in place. You just have the variance for that term, that period of time.
Well, and the variance, just provides additional time.
Right.
So, you might want to consider a water body variance if, all the dischargers, are having trouble meeting their permit limits on the basis of this waste load allocation. And, it's like, gives a little bit of extra time. It does slow down progress, but it's an alternative to changing the designated use.
Okay, so it would essentially freeze the waste load allocations if it was a water body specific.
Yeah, for the permittees that the variance applies to.
Sorry, I just have one more question. Do you know if this variance has been used for NPES permits for MS4 permittees?
As not yet, I don't believe.
What
I don't know of
kind
all
of-
of them.
Okay.
So it could be- but you could, but your, so your HEC has to just be quantifiable. So you could have an HEC2 variance, which is an interim effluent condition. So that could be, for example, something quantifiable would be a number of CSOs, right?
I mean, the MS4 permits, my understanding is that they're mostly just BMPs. So they're not usually quantified. I don't know, maybe here in California it's different.
Yeah, we do everything different.
We could look into that question and get
California.
back to you on that one, actually. I'll look into that more for you.
The manner in which the federal variance rule is written is that it's available to alleviate water quality-based effluent limits that are required by the Clean Water Act. Now, we know that WQ bells are not required under 402P for MS4s. And so there's a little bit of a legal application question there. But what I understand from EPA, from informal conversations, is that insofar as an MS4 is assigned waste load allocations via TMDL, or if they're assigned effluent limits, that there's no reason why the practicality and the purpose of the variance rule shouldn't also be available to MS4s. So I think there's some gray area. Obviously, we haven't established one yet, but I know that MS4s are very interested in the variance rule being available to them. I think the bigger question is so I think certainly if MS4s are assigned effluent limits, it's plausible that it could be available. You have to satisfy everything else under the rule, like the 101.10G factors. But then the larger question is what if they're not assigned effluent limits per se, but there's a receiving water limit that they can't comply with? Is the fact of that receiving water limit construed as an effluent limit that necessarily would make MS4s across the state available to the, for the federal rule? And that's a larger question that the MS4s are sort of gunning for, because they want that flexibility to be available on a statewide level.
So what is the answer to that? So does it apply to receiving water limits?
Well, so that's a legal question. I don't know the answer to that. I think, I mean, for our permit folks, that are receiving water limits construed as an effluent limit, or is there a colorable argument that they should be construed? And I'm not familiar enough with permitting to know the answer to that.
So for Region 8, so we have some that have receiving water limitations and effluent limitations. I know Region 4 has effluent limitations too. So, yeah. But I am also curious if you only had receiving water limitations, if it would apply.
I am as well. And I think so. That's definitely one legal question that needs to be resolved, and I think many folks have an interest in it. And then the other issue is notwithstanding the answer to that question, is the variance tool and the whole purpose for which it's designed, is it the best tool for the MS4 in that situation? So even legally, if it was available, perhaps that's not the best tool to utilize in any event. So it has to be a case-by-case basis, which is what the variance rule requires.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a couple more questions. So if a state or authorized tribe can use, or a state or authorized tribe can only use one water quality standards variance tool at a time, one water quality standards tool at a time. If it picks a variance, then it cannot also use a permit compliance schedule, because otherwise they are just compounding the delay. True or false? False. Okay. So this is, I'm not going to read that whole thing now, but I had mentioned before that you can use a compliance schedule in coordination with the variance. So this is just a figure, kind of one example of how that might work. You'll see that this is year 0 here, where the state adopts and EPA approves the variance, and the variance begins. So this is, this purple line is the WQ bell. Down is more stringent and higher is less stringent. So you'll see before the variance started, the WQ bell derived from the criterion is more stringent, and then that purple dot is the variance showing the variance WQ bell. So that's where they right, okay, so this is where they are now, and this is the highest attainable condition identified in the variance. So this is why they need the permit compliance schedule, because they can't meet the highest attainable, they can't meet the WQ bell derived from the HAC on day 1. So it's a 15-year variance, so there's 3 permit terms, and then they're getting a permit compliance schedule for the term of the variance, and then that would have a series of enforceable actions, remember, to get them to be meeting the highest attainable condition by the end of the term of the variance. So you'll see that the WQ bell is getting, or the effluent condition, sorry, is getting better during that time period because they're conducting all those activities, meeting their compliance schedule terms, and so they're meeting the HAC by the end of the variance. Yes.
So it's pretty unusual for permits to be reissued every 5 years. So in that instance, if a permit was administratively continued, would the variance or compliance schedule also are administratively continued as well?
So the variance would expire. So the question is basically if a permit is administratively continued, does the variance administratively continue? So the variance technically, the variance expires, right, during the time that the permit is administratively continued. Technically, there's no longer that variance. But you have permit as a shield when the permit is administratively continued. So the permittee would still be held accountable to the QBELs derived from the variance because that's what they were being held to before the permit was administratively continued, right? So for purposes of the variance, no, the variance ends. The variance itself is not administratively continued, but the permit limits would still be the same during that continuation because they have the permit as a shield during their administrative continuation. Does that sort of make sense? So it's that the variance itself is not being administratively continued because that's a standard. So it ends, it has a defined term. But the permittee, for all intents and purposes, is still has the same effluent limits as they did under the variance. Does that make sense? Did you want to add something, Terry?
No, I just want to have sort of a corollary to that. So if the permit is administratively extended, when it's 6 years and you haven't done your reevaluation at 5 years, then it's gone.
I'm not sure I understand the example.
So the reevaluation has to be done every 5 years, right?
But, okay.
So if you wait to the 6th year to do your reevaluation in accordance with the permit.
Right, but, well, the reevaluation is under the terms of the variance.
Right, but it has to be done every 5 years.
Okay,
So if you didn't do it at year 5,
right.
because you were waiting to redo the permit,
But you still have to do the variance reevaluations according to the terms of the variance.
exactly, every 5 years.
Right. So you're saying but in this case, the variance would still be in effect, right? You're saying the variance expires?
It would expire, right, because they didn't do their 5-year evaluation.
It's not expired when they don't do the reevaluation. It's just suspended and the underlying criterion are in effect until the reevaluation is completed and submitted to EPA.
Oh, okay.
So if they didn't do the reevaluation and now the underlying criterion is in
Right,
effect,
that could be an
and then they reissue the permit,
Right.
that new permit has
Based
to
on
derive
that.
from and comply with the underlying
Yep.
standard.
Yes. Yeah.
Quick question, is it possible to apply the variance in the middle of the permit time?
So that's a good question. That's explained in our regulations too in the section about permits and variances. So if the state and the permit writer, if the permit writer knows that the variance will expire mid-permit term, there needs to be 2 permit limits. There needs to be a permit limit under the variance and a permit limit when the variance is not applicable.
It means that if they apply to new permit, it means that they need to apply a new variance. That the previous variance will not be valid.
You say that again? I'm not sure.
For example, that it's a permittee started their permit activity, and then, for example, starting today, 5 years. In the middle of that permit, they apply the variance.
Okay.
Right, and then but when permit will over, the variance still will be continued.
You're saying the permit would be renewed during the term of the variance?
Will that variance, if the permittees apply for next permit, will the same variance be work for them?
So the variance is in effect for the term of the variance, and you're saying if the permit needs to be renewed during the term of the variance?
Yes.
Is that the question? So yeah, I mean the variance applies to that permittee for that pollutant for the term of the variance. So if you have however long the variance is, the permits that are renewed within that variance term, the variance is the applicable water quality standard. Yeah. But Gary.
But if the permit writer knows that the variance is going to expire in that subsequent term, then they must put into that permit two Q bills, one for the variance term and then for the period of time when the variance is expired.
So if you do a reevaluation and the HAC changes, but do you have to amend the permit to incorporate that? So if the reevaluation
permit
doesn't-
renewal.
Okay, so not-
Would add
okay.
permit renewal, because they'd still, I believe, right? I'm not a permit expert, but I would guess they would have permit as a shield, right, until their permit term ends.
Unless you included that in the permit as a special condition.
As if there was a
Although that's an interesting
reevaluation
question.
in it.
Let me back up on that. I'll check on that one, because that is part of the variance to say that the HAC would become the more stringent. So let me check on that, actually. Yeah. Oh, it's the same one again. Okay, yes.
Let me just say, I think
That there's no requirement that a permit be reopened.
Right.
As a result of the variance reevaluation. But that, yeah, but it is an option that a permit writer could put into the permit.
I think maybe we can do one more question, and then I just want to get through this last question and then just show you the implementation tool in 3 minutes. Did anyone have a burning last question? Okay, so just quickly, I think we already talked about this a lot, but, well, maybe not a lot, but just for true or false, just like for permit compliance schedules, states and authorized tribes must adopt authorizing provisions for variances before they can use a water quality standard variance. That is false. 131.14 authorizes the use of variances, but a state or tribe could choose to adopt an authorizing provision or procedures related to variances, but that would be considered a standard that would be submitted to EPA to act on for approval or disapproval. Okay, so this last slide, and you all have access to this, just has some links for helpful resources. We have a variances website, which is listed there, which has a lot of different resources, including our variance building tool, which I'm going to show you very briefly shortly. And then within that building tool is a separate resources tab that has a bunch of really helpful checklists, and it has a link to our interim economic guidance for water quality standards, which Gary's going to talk to you more about after lunch today. It has some worksheets related to that economic guidance, and then some FAQs that were actually written pre-reg revision, but are still helpful on multiple discharge or variances. So thank you. There's my email if you have other questions. And then I just think I'm not done yet. I just want to briefly show you the variance building tool. Can you all see that? Okay, I'm sorry that my back is to you. There's really no good way to do this here. Okay, so this is an implementation support tool designed to help entities such as states or authorized tribes determine if a variance is the appropriate tool for your situation. There's a whole bunch of disclaimers here about that use of this tool doesn't guarantee EPA approval. Another question people had asked was, well, is EPA getting this information that I'm entering into the tool? We don't in any way see you entering information. Nothing gets sent to EPA. It doesn't even bookmark your browser or anything like that. What you do get at the end is just some very basic kind of boilerplate boilerplate language that you could potentially use when developing a variance. So it kind of takes the information that you're inputting and spits out some language you can use as a starting point for a variance. So I'll just show you really briefly. I actually found this tool really useful to help understand some of the regulations, because it really walks you through in sort of a decision tree type of manner through the regulations and then guides you based on your answers. I'll say that in your electronic resources, you have a copy of the building tool flowchart, which might be useful for your variance exercise this afternoon. Hint, hint. Okay, this is just a disclaimer. So I'll just show you kind of how it works through this. So this is just asking who has jurisdiction over the variance. So this is, we'll just say it's a state. So then it's going to go through and ask you what your currently applicable water quality standards are, because remember the variance is a time-limited interim water quality standard, so you need to know what you're starting with. I'm just going to type really quickly. It's saying that it's a cold water aquatic life use that you have now. So you remember your variance is for a specific pollutant or parameter, so we're going to say it's dissolved copper in this example. It's just asking you. This is asking you for the currently applicable criterion. So just for purposes of example here, we'll just say it's a chronic freshwater aquatic life criterion of 18 micrograms per liter. Okay, so I mentioned very briefly that a variance is not something you can use if you can meet the underlying standards by achieving or by implementing the T-bells. So this is just making sure you understand that requirement. So it's just saying, can the applicable designated use criterion addressed by the variance be achieved by implementing T-bells? So like if you say yes, if you answer a question that's not going to comply with the regulations, it's going to give you a red explanation box as to why that's not right. And then you go back, it'll give you this, okay. So it gives you this pop-up box just saying you're making a different choice. Are you sure you want to change your mind? And this is just asking, is the permittee able to meet the WQBL derived from the underlying criteria? And I mean, obviously, if they can do that, they don't need a variance, right? So you can sort of see how this walks you through. This is there an enforceable series of actions? So can they get a compliance schedule to meet the underlying, then they wouldn't need a variance either. So you can just sort of see, I know I'm over time and cutting into your lunch, so you can see how this tool walks you through some of the regulations in order of what's required for the variance. And it's helpful to have some of your supporting documentation with you and working through this. Just sort of an interesting tool for you to check out. So with that, I will let you go. And I believe we're coming back at 1 p.m.